Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Our current session is about the difference between a language and a dialect. I hope and expect by the end of this session you would be able to differentiate between the two terms. Well, we need to think about what is a language, what is a dialect, is there any difference between a language and a dialect, and where are the boundaries of the two terms blurred. Through the session, we would try to answer these questions. Well, generally speaking, it is a part of our culture to make a distinction between languages and dialects. Zuban and Boli. In fact, we make two separate distinctions using these terms, and this does not happen only in our culture. This happens in many cultures, and generically speaking, in the English culture, this also happens. We make two different distinctions using these terms, and we draw conclusions from the fact about their culturally inherited views that we have established about language over the times. We may contrast our culture in this respect with some other cultures where this distinction is not made. I would here give an example from Hogan 1966, who says this was the case in England until the term dialect was borrowed in the Renaissance time, and actually this term was borrowed from where? From the Greek context. Distinction between language and dialect is actually what is made by, as I have said, taken from the Greek context, and the word dialect and language, the equivalents of it as they were in the Greek, when they were translated into English, this distinction emerged. A number of clearly distinct written varieties in use in classical Greece were found, and each was associated with a particular class or a particular group of people or with a particular speech community at that time. Thus, the meanings of the Greek terms which were translated as language and as dialect were in fact quite different from the meanings these words have in English now. Their equivalents in French language, I would say they are more, close. They are closer to, the original Greek words. For example, dialecte is the word that refers to the regional varieties in French language that are written or that have a literature, in contrast to the regional varieties which are not written. There is nothing absolute about the distinction between in English language that happens to make a difference between what would be called a language and what would be called a dialect. If there is a variety of language, whether you would call it a language or you would call it a dialect. And let me rephrase this: if there is a code, if there is a linguistic code, whether you would call it a language or you would call it a dialect, this distinction is very fuzzy in English. What then is in the difference between the two terms as it is used in all the literature that is available in linguistics and in sociolinguistics that is written in English language? Well, my dear students, there are two ways of distinguishing them, and this ambiguity actually is a source of great confusion regarding both the terms. Hogan 1966 argues that the reason for the ambiguity and the resulting confusion is precisely the fact that the word dialect itself was borrowed from the Greek origin. Sometimes, on the other hand, the distinction is made on the basis of the size, because there is a general idea that is believed in that language is bigger, it is larger in size, whereas a dialect is smaller. It is, in size, it is not as large as a language. So, a variety called a language contains more linguistic items. This is one of the conclusions, of course, that we can draw from that. Whereas a dialect would have lesser number of items. If you look at the fund of vocabulary of a code, a language would have more items, whereas a dialect would have a lesser number of items. But more or less are two relative terms, so there is an ambiguity related to that. What do we mean by more, or what do we mean by less? What would be counted as less or what would be counted as more? Because there is no number as such that is claimed. So this is a sense in which we may refer to English as a language, for example, containing the sum total of all the terms in all the dialects, such as Standard English as one dialect among others, for example, Yorkshire English, Indian English, Australian English as well. So, the question arises whether we would call all these varieties of American, British, Australian, Pakistani, Indian, New Zealand English, Canadian English, etc. as dialects of English, or we would call them varieties of English language. The other contrast between language and dialect is a question of, or is an issue of prestige. Generally speaking, laymen would associate prestige with language, whereas dialects would be considered less prestigious. Whether some variety is called a language or a dialect depends on how much prestige one thinks it has. Depending upon the culture, and this is not a very clear-cut matter otherwise. Depending upon the cultural attitude towards, these varieties of codes, if a variety is considered to be superior, it would be called a language. If it is considered to be of less significance or inferior culturally, then it would be termed as a dialect. So, according to people in Britain, habitually they refer to languages which are unwritten or which they think are unwritten as dialects. So, any language that the British laymen would find or would think of as being in unwritten form, they would call it a dialect, or any form that they think is in a written form, they would call it a language proper, and they would call it, language, not a dialect.